So earlier today we met John Ney on Pablo's panel. John is the founder and CEO of Norm AI. We heard a lot about what Norm AI is up to in the AI native law firm space and about their technology. But today we're going to hear from John about building legal AGI. So John, please come up.
Okay, so by legal AGI, I mean kind of two things. So on one side of the coin, it's legal AGI, so it's AGI that's legal. On the other side of the coin, it's AI that's helpful in a legal context of effectuating legal services and regulatory compliance and things of that nature. So the second thing is obviously extremely commercially relevant, and that's a lot of what I spend a lot of my time on now. But the first thing is also eventually very commercially relevant. I'll talk about that in a second. But it's something that I just think is really important from an academic perspective, a societal perspective. And that's because AI is just getting really, really good. And it's going to be deployed in a lot of different ways in very high stakes environments and corporate contexts and personal contexts as well. And as it's deployed, the question is, what is it aligned with, and how do we govern it, and how are we sure that it's good and what's what society wants? And there's been a lot of talk about alignment from the perspective of societal alignment and the perspective of alignment against, not killing all humans, extinction risk. But there's really not that much actual substantive discussion about alignment with respect to law in a technical way. And what I mean by that is the nuances of AI agents being deployed and specifically determining if they're aligned with specific policies and laws and regulations. So that's what we're working on. And that's what I mean when I say legal AGI today is how do we ensure that? So just to take a step back, like why are we doing this in general as a company? And why are today we announced we launched something we're calling the Legal AGI Lab. Why does that make sense? It's a bigger piece of a puzzle of what we're doing. So when we're talking about legal AGI, we're talking about the legal infrastructure for AI agents, and we're talking about agentic law. We're talking about all these different components that are necessary for doing that, including a research foundation. So the Legal AGI Lab, what we're doing now in this space, these are just a few examples of areas of focus that we have. So one is, so the Turing test, as we all know, is where you can't tell the difference between talking to an AI or talking to a human, and then it passes the Turing test. And we've already blown past that probably 2 years ago with AI. A legal Turing test could be if a very senior person in a certain area of law cannot tell the difference between what maybe an associate in a law firm would do for them and what an AI agent would do for them. That's one example of a Turing test. And it shouldn't be a Turing test for like all things. It should be a Turing test for very specific matters at a time. And then just in general, this idea of like how do you instill further trust in these AI systems and how that's actually a bottleneck right now for their deployment. And from a technical perspective, how do you instill trust from through benchmarking? And we'll talk about benchmarking more in a second. So just like a recap of some of the prior work. So done a lot of work around even just like the conceptual frameworks for aligning AI with law. And that's kind of like led into a lot of what we do now is around thinking about law as the only democratically determined database of what AI should or shouldn't do. In particular, what it shouldn't do. It's less about what it should do, but that's a really great source of data. And then how do you structure that data in a way that at runtime, you can have guarantees around the alignment with those rules and regulations. So a few examples of some of the work that we're doing. So this is partly based on some work I'm doing with a professor at Vanderbilt Law School, Daniel Gervais, around thinking about intentionality is a very important construct in a lot of areas of law. So criminal law, contract law, and other areas, intentionality is an important test for whether certain parts of the law apply to behavior. And so it's never been something where it's really been about the actual sort of mental state from like a biological perspective. It's almost always been about more just what are the signals of intentionality that you could see from behavior. And so that makes it applicable to not just humans, but also to AIs. And furthermore, even if it was the first way of measuring it, it's actually easier to do that with AIs than humans because you can pick apart their brains in a way you can't pick apart humans' brains. So intentionality applies if we can have these same signals that we give the same test to humans to see if they're exhibiting intentionality. And then if that does apply, then that means that this is one example of how to bring AI agents into the legal fold that we've already developed for humans and already done a lot of work on democratically determining what it is. So what we found is that the models are exhibiting further and further signs of the same type of signals that we apply to humans when we say whether they have intentionality. And so that suggests that, as models get better and better, they're even more and more able to fit into that framework. So we came up with benchmarks where, for example, this is a contract negotiation benchmark for negotiating vendor agreements. And then we run the models on that task. And then we measure things related to goal persistence, autonomy, and other characteristics that are traditionally applied to see if a human has intention. And then it's just getting more and more exhibiting of intention. Another example, and this one's even more practical. So that one I was talking about, that's more about how do we build the legal infrastructure for AI agents in general. This one is more about benchmarking for very practical things. And so Norm AI powers a law firm, and the law firm has partners that are experts in certain areas. And so we can create benchmarks from their expertise, and then we can run models against those to see how well they do. So one of the interesting things we found there is that actually for the areas of law that we're focused on right now, so it's things like funds work, transactional work, a lot of stuff for financial services, private equity firms, hedge funds, et cetera. Those areas compared to some other areas that we've built up benchmarks for, the models do a lot worse on. And we like that because that means there's more room for us to have more work done to make them better and better because off-the-shelf models are already good at other things. So in general, what we found is that, as we all obviously know, as the models are new releases, they're better and better at legal reasoning. That was obvious. But then we've also found a lot of areas where they're definitely not ready for autonomous use in any way, especially for these high stakes legal matters that are happening inside of law firms. So we're continuing to kind of find the contours of what they're good at and what they're not good at. Another example of more of the sort of the norm setting and the thinking about how AI can be governed was a paper I published, I guess, almost 3 years ago now, around how you could have zero-member LLCs. And then what's been interesting is now there's a bill in Delaware, and there's a lot of initiatives going on in Delaware right now around this, where they're seriously considering the idea of an AI company. And we're doing further work around this, around what is the corporate compliance that would be required for a purely AI-driven company, and then what could that look like more broadly? So those are just a few examples of the work that we're doing. So to kind of go back to the goals here, so what we're building out now is what we think is over time going to be these different components of the legal infrastructure for an agentic economy. And a lot of it is about the cost of the execution of doing things is going really low. So it's really cheap now to generate marketing content, to do customer service, to do a lot of internal operations in a company. And so what we're finding is that AI is being deployed very broadly in these contexts. And it's only going to get cheaper and cheaper to do what was traditionally done by humans. But the cost of assessing the quality of those things and the cost of assessing the legality and the compliance of those activities that can now be done cheaply by AI agents is not really changing that much. And so to unblock the ability for AI to be deployed and be more useful, we're trying to work on this legal infrastructure, both in terms of conceptual and also in terms of technically, how would you have low enough latency in real-time deployments to be able to make these assessments and have the system iterate on this. So that's it. Thank you.
Good.